Well, good good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Smith, and I am currently serving as the Worshipful Master of the Oklahoma Lodge of Research. The Oklahoma Lodge of Research was chartered in 1967 to promote, encourage, preserve, and foster research and study for the purpose of spreading Masonic light and knowledge. In normal years, we would have stated meetings on a quarterly basis and take care of our business and then reward ourselves by listening to presentations on Masonic topics. But as we all know, this has not been a normal year. Hopefully 2021 will become such. As we endeavor to press on the pursuit of spreading Masonic light and knowledge in the age of COVID-19, I would like to thank you for joining us today for the next installment in our virtual education series. Also, especially want to thank our guest speaker today, Right Worshipful Robert Johnson. Brother Johnson received his degrees from Waukegan Lodge number 78 in Waukegan, Illinois, becoming Worshipful Master in 2014. He since served as both a District Education Officer and a District Deputy Grand Master. He currently serves on the Grand Lodge of Illinois Education Committee and as Secretary of Spade Novum number 1183, the premier education lodge in Illinois. You may already be familiar with our good brother through his work on the Whence Came You and the Masonic Roundtable podcasts, numbering in the hundreds of episodes now on both of those. His presentation this morning is titled The Masonic Pub Crawl, Freemasonry in America and its Colonial Tavern Beginnings. Okay, take it away, Brother Johnson.
Thank you, Worshipful. Can you guys hear me okay? Is my audio coming through?
Sounds good.
All right. Well, first, let me just this here and start sharing. Okay. Share screen. Share. All right, so you all should see a black screen. Is that correct? All right.
That's correct.
So this was going to be the presentation. I was just going to hijack it and go off on a crazy tangent, the UAP disclosure and Freemasonry, but I guess we'll stick to the plan since Jason's a good friend. Today's presentation was actually kind of an interesting one that didn't come out as planned. Originally, I was asked to do a presentation for Pleiades Lodge in Westchester, Illinois. And they invited me to come out and do a presentation, but I didn't know what I was going to do it on. And I was talking with, at the time, my good friend and brother, Bill Hosler. You guys might know him from his fiction series, The 50-Year Mason, that he's published several pieces on. And he said, well, Robert, you brew beer and you're a Freemason. Can you do something about beer brewing and Freemasonry? And I thought, well, maybe. And then I thought back to the first time I read a piece from the Midnight Freemasons on the podcast, which was George Washington's beer recipe. And that came from Brother Todd Creason. And he had a copy, a facsimile copy of the beer recipe sitting there. And I thought, how crazy is that? I brew beer. If we have any fellow Zimmergists out there, you know what's going on. You kind of freak out. You want to make this recipe, but it's really difficult to make. So then I thought, well, how can I turn this into a real Masonic, a really great piece? And really, I guess I had already done the lion's share of the work because I had been writing for a men's magazine for a while called Iron Mike. And I had wrote about these 3 taverns along the Eastern Shore that had the influence of Freemasonry there. Sorry about my dogs. And so the most of the work was already done, and I thought, well, this is cool. Let me just look at these taverns, and it turns out all three of those taverns had Masonic connections, but not just little ones, pretty big ones, which was pretty awesome. So that's where we're going to start today. Again, the Masonic pub crawl, Freemasonry in America and its Colonial Tavern beginnings. So the first thing I'll show is a couple neat facts. First is the 1606 slab. This is kind of contentious. There's supposedly a slab that was found, and this slab had Masonic markings in it as early as 1606. There were some drawings made, that kind of thing, which most or all have been lost unto history. So whether we believe it or not, there is apparently a Masonic presence in America here in 1606. Not that surprising, considering, we have the works of Brother Scott Walter, who talks about the hooked X and people coming over and that kind of thing. So there's likely there had to have been a Mason that stepped foot on the U.S. continent at the time. There's a guy named John Skeen who is raised, I say raised in 1682. That term really doesn't apply. The third degree isn't around, but becomes a Mason. He's the first Mason in the New World in 1684. So first guy to come over here that they know is a Freemason on the books. Now, the 1606 slab, who knows who that was, but we have a guy named Daniel Cox, who is made the provincial Grand Master over the United States. And then I have these 3 question marks, June 5th, 1730. And that is because when Daniel Cox is, quote unquote, made this provincial Grand Master, it's not necessarily that he's made this Grand Master. He is addressed so at an event. And then the minutes of that event, or the account of that event, are actually recorded, and it mentions this. And this is an interesting concept as well, because we don't have, a national Grand Master, let alone a provincial Grand Master over the United States. We have Jonathan Belcher, who is among he's to have become a Mason. So I say American, the North American continent is what we're talking about. So the first recorded person who comes over to be made a Mason, who's born on the soil. Now, is it accurate? Maybe. Did we just pick a name out of the hat? Perhaps. If you go on Wikipedia, there's actually a listing for the first baby boomer ever born. They've given her a name. I found this out from Brother illustrious Steve Harrison. So it's no coincidence that we like to figure out who the first was and put a name up there to connect ourselves to something. And then I think lastly, something that's important to talk about very briefly here is the fact that when the War of American Independence breaks out, when you learn about this in grade school and a little bit in junior high, unless you really dive into this stuff in your later educational years, you might continually have this idea, this picture of King George as a crotchety old man with white hair who's old and a jerk. But when this war breaks out, he's 45 years old. He's younger than the collective average age of the craft by 20 years. So what's the deal? Well, King George is largely, if you really want to read a great book, George McCullough's 1776 is a primary resource in this presentation, I'll tell you that. But he gives a really objective look at the war and what is interesting about it. King George isn't some massive jerk. He is, of course, a king. He has some, aristocratic beliefs and practices. But one of the things that he's really tasked with is upholding the honor of England. And at this point, the honor of England has been attacked more than a little. So let me show you. I'm hoping. I'm going to stop share for just a moment. All right, now we're sharing again. I'm going to play a short clip here, the trailer for Sons of Liberty.
You're not talking about defending your rights as Englishmen. You're talking about a new country. All the colonies united. A new nation.
Any man found violation of His Majesty's laws will be dealt with without mercy.
I'll be the first.
There's been an incident in the colonies.
A group of rebels causing mischief and mayhem in the streets.
These are our streets!
Gentlemen, you will henceforth be known as the Minutemen.
These colonists are committing treason. They are thugs and outlaws, the sons of tyranny. They should be beaten into submission. Send in the troops.
I found you!
We need more guns.
You have the influence, I have the money.
This has gone too far. It has to end now.
So this is where greatness resides.
To show them what we're made of.
The British are coming! The British are coming!
This is just the beginning.
So there you have this really interesting kind of Hollywood look at an interpretation of the first stage of the American War of Independence. It was a really good 3-part series. If you can catch it, I would definitely catch it. I think they stream it on History Channel's like on demand, and it expires sometime in like 2026. So they have no intention of removing it. It's a real, again, it's very accurate in terms of events and the linear timeline. We have Sam Adams, who's portrayed here as this young guy. Real life, Sam Adams is not that young, not that fit, not that sober. He had his problems. Not a Freemason either. Of course, Benjamin Franklin is portrayed here as probably a little more realistic than what we like to think of him as, this kind of aristocrat. But we do know that he had some habits. And then, of course, one of the more here, I think, is brother Paul Revere, past Grandmaster Paul Revere, who is portrayed kind of like this ragtag, rough and tough gent, which was true. I mean, Paul Revere was renowned for being those things, being a hard person to deal with, a commanding persona, and was even later tried for abandonment and was court-martialed. But ultimately, those charges didn't stick. It was his commanding officer who was at fault. But let's dive into this. So Freemasons and historians are really speaking fondly today, through all time, really, about patriotic beginnings of America, and with that, about our fraternity's involvement in those beginnings. And in the early 1700s, Freemasons were, as we know, some of the most influential men in the society. The public house of the tavern was a common place of the day where all men, where men of all walks of life would happen upon and find comfort in a pint of ale and sometimes a hot meal. This is a place that men of every station in society can get together on the level. And if that doesn't sound familiar to our Masonic brothers listening and watching, then attend lodge more. Now, we're going to cover 3 main taverns here, and the first of these is the Tun Tavern. Many stories have been told about this famous tavern in colonial America in general, many of them, but this one in particular, many people know about already. And so for that reason, we're going to start with it. Now, although there is some confusion about its origin and when it became an official lodge, its story is a good one. Now, the Tun Tavern was built in 1685. Tun is this old English word for barrel or keg. It's located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at the corner of Water Street and Tun Alley. The Tun Tavern was to be the birthplace of several organizations. Most famously is the United States Marine Corps. Now, of course, these guys are just celebrated another birthday not too long ago. November 10th, 1775 was when they were first instituted by the Continental Congress. Now, the Continental Congress, of course, is our government body who is around before we have a true government. Little known and less talked about fact, everybody says, hey, you know, our first president in the United States was a Freemason. Well, the first president of the Continental Congress was also a Freemason, and that's just interesting. Now, the Continental Congress gives permission to this guy, Sam Nicholas, who is also a brother. He's an innkeeper, and they give him orders to raise 2 battalions of Marines for Philadelphia. Now, in these days, as you can imagine, there's a lot of contention among the colonists and the British. If we remember correctly, our history, we're dealing with the Stamp Act, among a lot of other things, which angered colonial Americans quite a bit, especially since these guys, the colonies rather, they had no say in the passing of a lot of the laws and ordinances due to the issue of representation. So because of these tensions that they're having, the battalions were deemed completely necessary. They were especially needed to help solve the problem of securing ships and crews during boarding actions by the British. And they're not only just being defensive, these guys are also conducting offensive combat assignments on a regular basis. So at this time, the Tun Tavern's manager, a guy named Robert Milan, he is one of the chief recruiters for the Marines. And it's rumored that volunteers for the Marine service were enticed by a beer, and you might actually just know that they probably didn't need much else as a perk, right? Here's a beer, here's a reason, and you've seen the reason happen out there on the streets. Tyranny is plaguing the streets of New England, and many felt it was time to stand up for something. So Captain Nicholas, as he was then known, actually took a lot of these recruits and formed the First Continental Marine Company, which, oddly enough, is comprised by 100 Rhode Islanders, is what's on account there. And of course, again, Sam Nicholas, a Freemason. Now, there were several other organizations which were started at this tavern as well. For instance, we have in 1720, the first meeting of the St. George Society. Now, this is an organization dedicated to helping poor Englishmen coming into America, or at that time, the North American continent, the colonies. This society lives on today under a few other names and some jurisdictional titles like this one, which is from New York. What's interesting about these societies as time moves on, you know, they start off as an immigrant society to help you. And now the United States government does a lot of that, or doesn't, depending on which side of the fence you fall. And what's interesting about this is they kind of rebrand themselves as societies that, heritage societies and the like. So we see this quite a bit. Maybe you know of a German historical society now, which perhaps was a society dedicated to helping German immigrants coming in. And now once a year they have a Oktoberfest. But anyway, so what we have here is one of the first formations of this society in 1720. Now, the Tun Tavern also hosted St. John's Lodge #1 of Philadelphia in some of its first meetings, and oddly enough was composed of only entered apprentices and fellow crafts. This is not that surprising considering that the Master Mason's degree was really only conferred in Master Mason's lodges at this point. Now, St. John's Lodge was also the place where Benjamin Franklin became a member. There is an account book of St. John's Lodge #1, and it's titled The Liber B. If you want to look it up, Libre, letter B. And there is some contention about its authenticity and what it contains. It's generally accepted that it is legitimate, but I would be remiss if I didn't come clean and say there is some contention about its authenticity. However, this account book has in its record the name of William Allen as the first Grand Master. Later, another lodge was formed, simply called the Tun Tavern Lodge #3, also meeting there. Now, the Tun Tavern Lodge and St. John's Lodge eventually moved to another place called the Indian King Hotel. And this is where they actually agreed to hold alternate meetings on Wednesdays so that there would be a Masonic meeting every week of the year. If you think you don't go home now to eat dinner, imagine living back then. So the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania today recognizes the Tun Tavern as the birthplace of Masonic teaching in America. In fact, some of the earliest known minutes for a Masonic organization are in North America, and they belong to Tun Tavern Lodge number 3. Excuse me. So 15 years later, after the formation of the St. George Society, I think it's about 15 years, we have the founding of St. Andrew's Society. Now, this is really similar to the Society of King George, only this particular society is founded to help, guess what, Scotsmen who are entering the United States or the U.S. colonies. The image here is shown from an organization in central Illinois, which was established in 1987. So probably more of a historical society in this one. But you have to ask why these societies were separate. Well, you can't have Scotsmen going to an English institution for assistance in that time. It wasn't really a thing. They weren't fond of each other. So the member rolls of the Tun Tavern Lodge actually report that there were about 87 regular members of the lodge and about 186 visiting members over time. So as for the Tun Tavern Lodge, these are some of the original signatures from the first page of the Tun Tavern Lodge's journal, which dates from 1749. Anybody who wants a copy of this, shoot me an email later. I'll give you my email address. I pulled this from JSTOR, which is just an academic storehouse of everything and anything. So some contention, if you guys are familiar with Henry Coyle, who's a famous author from Massachusetts and historian, Henry Coyle says that the Tun Tavern Lodge was never warranted nor issued a charter, being a quote-unquote immemorial rights lodge. That's pretty interesting. Now, the Tun Tavern Lodge is burned down in 1781, and today, Interstate 95 runs right through where that tavern once stood. Now, if you want to see what that tavern looked like or felt like, you can have a chance to do so, certainly by visiting the museum in Quantico, Virginia. They have a Tun Tavern themed restaurant, which serves a lunch menu, has some adult beverages, and a famous bread pudding. We can move on to the Bunch of Grapes Tavern. This tavern is in operation a really long time. It officially opens its doors in 1712. The Bunch of Grapes Tavern is pretty interesting because it also claims to be the home of St. John's Lodge number 1. Now, in this time, and we've got all these colonies, and how can we have the mixing of different lodges? Well, I'll explain this, but for a Masonic noob, it's confusing. For us who have been around a long time, it just goes without saying. But so the Bunch of Grapes Tavern, again, claims to be the home of St. John's Lodge number 1. However, this is because it was not just a lodge. It was, in fact, another St. John's Lodge, which is recognized as the first Grand Lodge in America, which was chartered in Boston 1733 and was known and recorded as the first lodge in the English rolls of 1734. Again, a lot of mixing of lodges and locations here, admittedly confusing. The image on your screen is a replica. I want to say that's the top floor of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. Just as you come up the stairs, you go down a long hallway of Grandmaster photographs, and that's kind of at the end of the hallway. But it's a replica of how the Bunch of Grapes Tavern got its name. So a bunch of grapes hanging outside of the window. And this has since been the main symbol used at the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts for branding. Well, on Monday, July 30th, 1733, the first Grand Lodge in America was founded by this super handsome fella, Henry Price. Now, if you have ever visited Massachusetts Masonry, Massachusetts Grand Lodge, you'll note that Henry Price, the quote-unquote godfather of American Freemasonry, he's got pictures everywhere, all over the Grand Lodge building. The busts of his face are everywhere. You can't go anywhere and escape the eye of Henry Price. Well, Henry Price receives his authority to create this first Grand Lodge from Lord Montague, who is the Grand Master of Masons in London. And there is some evidence, actually, which suggests that this particular Grand Lodge is operating as early as 1730, a full 3 years before having the dispensation, and also predating a few of the Tun Tavern claims of meeting dates as well. Now, the Bunch of Grapes Tavern had some dark history as well. Being located on King Street, there's a half a mile of street where there were two other taverns, the Royal Exchange and the Crown Coffee House, all of which were very popular for a drink. And that dark history is that they were also slave clearinghouses. Now, the Bunch of Grapes Tavern is not particularly involved with the planning of the American Revolution. However, it is a place that kind of shifts with the winds. During this era of the Revolution, the tavern became known as the Whig Tavern. If you've heard of the High Whigs before, the Whig Party, this is an early party in American politics. If you know your history about Abraham Lincoln and the political parties of his day, it is something there as well. This is a piece of artwork from a more modern interpretation of the Whig Party. But these guys would meet at the Bunch of Grapes as their designated meeting house. Now, they can best be described, I'll put this in air quotes, as a political action group with a snobbish aristocracy at that time. And that's not my words. That's just what I've pulled from text. But these guys are nonetheless big money that had been sympathetic to the cause, which, of course, at this point was this brooding idea of American independence. Now, at a point during the British occupation of Boston, British troops had made this a meeting place as well. And sometime later, after the siege of Boston, General George Washington, Marquis de Lafayette, and Washington's great friend John Stark, all of whom who were brothers of the craft, were handsomely entertained at the Bunch of Grapes Tavern, as it was well-deserved. Now, I mentioned the Siege of Boston, which was one of the first chapters of the American Revolution. If you're unfamiliar, this is where the show that I showed you the trailer for at the beginning, it culminates in this very scene or act. This is essentially when the New England militiamen became the Continental Army, and they were led by General George Washington into a siege where they surrounded Boston, Massachusetts. So if you saw that History Channel documentary, that is where that culminates. Every time I see this picture of Paul Revere, I just think about Jack Black. So if I just destroyed that image for you, I apologize. But Brother Paul Revere frequented the Bunch of Grapes Tavern on a number of occasions to quench a thirst. And one man, Captain Francis Golay, described the Bunch of Grapes Tavern as the quote-unquote best punch house in Boston. Now, the tavern's real contribution to America and its involvement of one of the first states of our union, and that state is Ohio. And this comes about through a group of men and committee members who needed to discuss lands in the Ohio Territory. And around 1787, they passed the Northwest Ordinance. You might remember that word or that grouping of words or an image like this from a high school textbook on the topic. But this is the place where they did all this, at the Bunch of Grapes Tavern. Now, today, the Bunch of Grapes Tavern is gone. It was actually demolished in 1798. However, there is a memorial plaque there which reads something pretty interesting. It says, "Here on the 30th of July, 1733, was instituted under charter from the Grand Lodge of England, the first regularly constituted lodge of free and accepted Masons in America, now St. John's Lodge of Boston. Here, 1786, was organized the Ohio Company, pioneer in the development of the Great West under the leadership of General Rufus Putnam." Remember that name. First township laid out in Marietta, Ohio. This tablet placed by the city of Boston, 30th of July, 1925. Here's why you should remember General Rufus Putnam. So he goes out to Marietta, Ohio, the Northwest Territory, Northwest Ordinance rather, and he comes into, quote unquote, Marietta, Ohio. Now, Rufus Putnam is a pioneer, but he's also the de facto first Grand Master of Masons in Ohio. We just kind of influence everything as we go. Now, this particular, so this is the first chartered Grand Lodge in the New World here at the Bunch of Grapes Tavern. But of course, there are some rival claims, namely within Pennsylvania. But today, nothing is left of this tavern except the plaque, which is on a building standing on State Street. Pardon me. So next, let's talk about the Green Dragon Tavern. This is the most famous. This tavern is located on Boston's North End on Union Street. Originally, this tavern had passed through the hands of several owners throughout the life of the building. And eventually, in 1743, William Douglas, who is a physician and he's a pamphleteer. If you don't know what that is, you can imagine people, writing their small pamphlets and selling them on the corner for pennies or whatever. It's like supplemental income back then. So I'm not going to say he's a snake oil salesman or anything like that, but you can think of things like that. So he's a pamphleteer, and he buys this home and he uses it as his quote unquote mansion house. So when Douglas dies in 1752, just 9 years after he buys it, it passes to his sister, who holds onto it for just a couple years. And eventually she sells it to St. Andrew's Lodge of Freemasons in 1766. Now, you're looking at the date. St. Andrew's Lodge chartered 1756. What were they doing for 10 years? Well, they're likely bouncing around to different hotels, different open pub houses, different union halls, perhaps, which is not that uncommon. We see that quite a bit. So they get their forever home, or something like it. And so they move in here in 1766, and the first floor of the building they use for the lodge building and some meetings and ritual work. But it's really when you get to the basement is when it gets interesting. Now, of the three lodges of the taverns I've talked about, I kind of saved the coolest for last. The basement of the Green Dragon Tavern is used for the meetings of several secret groups, and of these groups we have the Boston Committee of Correspondence. The title of this group doesn't sound very menacing or driving fear to the hearts of men, right? But that might be by design. What we're looking at is, I'll put this again in air quotes. They say that the Boston Committee of Correspondence could have been a quote-unquote shadow government led by the leaders of 13 colonies. Now, this particular location was the first of several quote-unquote correspondence committees Act, which was set up by Parliament. And they did this because several of the British merchants living in the colonies were accepting paper money issued by the colonists instead of the British pounds. They wanted to outlaw this. You can't accept that filthy colonial money. You have to take British pounds only. So because this correspondence committee is set up to address the Currency Act, you can already see how this one group is starting some serious business. But that really wasn't the only group that met at the Green Dragon Tavern. We also have the Boston Caucus, another non-threatening sounding name. This group is founded much earlier in 1719 by another physician named Dr. Elijah Cook Jr. But really the activities which make this group famous happen under the leadership of none other than Sam Adams. The group itself, and its use of the word caucus for our etymology nerds out there, really, it may be one of the first, if not the first, use of a word in its meaning of a group of people meeting together to form a political movement or a party to agree on a common position. Now, while under the influence of Sam Adams, the group is insistent on protecting the rights of Boston's lower and middle classes, as well as protecting popular social programs that would help those same classes. This is a key right here. Now, Sam Adams is not a brother of the craft. However, what he's talking about here is the Masonic justice. He's protecting social programs. Today, we call that social justice. And now comes one of the more secret groups that meet here, and this is the Loyal Nine. Now, this, of course, is a patriot organization which is pretty shrouded in secrecy. This is formed in 1765 by 9 like-minded fellows of Boston to protest the passing of the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act is, as it was called, is essentially a tax on all, well, Britain tried to impose this tax on all printed paper products like newspapers, playing cards, legal documents. It didn't matter what it was, you had to pay a tax on it. The reason, British trying to raise funds for protecting the American frontier along the Appalachian Mountains by sending 10,000 troops there. Now, the colonialists aren't so much mad at this, but they're really upset that Britain is trying to raise money for a project in the Americas. Now, first of all, they felt they didn't need to do this because they think that the British crown has it. Maybe they don't, but they don't know this. And second, it's passed without the colony's legislature, or their say rather. And of course, the Loyal Nine is the precursor to the formation of a now infamous group, the Sons of Liberty, which leads us into that famous saying, no taxation without representation. Now, the Sons of Liberty, all the previous groups I've mentioned here, all have members who have joined this one group designed to protect Boston's people on the streets at any cost. The group formed in 1764 and had many notable members, many of whom were Freemasons. The group receives its name from Isaac Barr when he refers to the colonies as the quote-unquote Sons of Liberty. And this is, in fact, the same group that planned the Boston Tea Party, and you can guess where they did it, the basement of the Green Dragon Tavern. Now, this is an old parchment that I'm going to show you here, and I'll show you a better blown-up version in a few minutes. And it says, where we met to plan the consignment of a few shiploads of tea, dated December 1773, signed John Johnson, Water Street, Boston, Mass, 1773. They even had their own flag, which the Loyal Nine had this flag. The Rebellious had this flag called the Sons of Liberty had this flag called the Rebellious, and it represents the Loyal Nine, which had this kind of uneven stripes of red and white. Now, for those of you who enjoy a bit of decoding or conspiracy or just plain symbology or hidden plain sight type stuff, I'll do that for just a quick moment here on a little tangent, which is fun. So this flag apparently represents the Loyal Nine, 9 upright individuals. So here we can see 9 stripes of the Rebellious separated into the 9 stripes, representing the, again, 9 like-minded individuals. But why the colors red and white? So for this, we can take some creative license, maybe travel back in time. How far back? Maybe the Knights Templar. In the Templar tunic and shield, the symbol of a red cross on the white background symbolized, among other things, a warrior's oath or honor-bound commitment to give his life and spill his or anyone else's blood for the cause. And the Templar cause, right, is this case for God and Christ. So we have this idea of martyrdom. And if we fast forward back to the time of the Loyal Nine, who had now laid down their lives for what they believed in, we can bring back the stripes as they once were. And now let's elongate those stripes to the rectangular shape of flags that we're all used to. And then we can add 4 more stripes to represent all 13 colonies who had gave life for our country. And finally, if we add that blue square, which represents, among several other things, the ideas of without limits, related to the sky, depths of the sea, truth, and even universality. And finally, we can add the stars representing the 50 great states of our nation. And you've really gone from the first 9 upright men who took a stand, lost their lives, and we laid them to rest. And it is more followed as all 13 colonies joined in. So it's quite fitting, in at least my opinion anyway, that we see martyrdom of brave men, women, and in many cases children who died fighting for the independence that we share today. Now, I know that's a little tangent, but let's get back on track to the Green Dragon. So the Green Dragon Tavern is known as the headquarters for the American Revolution by many historians today. In fact, Brother Paul Revere leaves this tavern to start his midnight ride to Lexington. Of course, Brother Paul Revere, midnight rider, Grand Master, who chartered 23 lodges as Grand Master. Now, the Green Dragon Tavern is demolished in 1854, but today, located at 11 Marshall Street on Boston's North End, is a new building titled the same, the Green Dragon Tavern, and they publicly state that they are the quote-unquote headquarters for the Revolution. You can visit them today. They've got a pretty good menu. It's a smaller place, right across the street, actually, from some colonial graves. Just if you see that image of the building there on the screen, if you follow that to the right, you'll go across the street and end up in a cemetery, which is absolutely amazing to visit. If you go to the left a few blocks, you can find Prince Hall's grave, which is outstanding as well. Now, I'm going to come to this idea of the honorable mention. So in my research, many times I run across neat facts about different places. And sometimes when I hear something totally fantastic, you dive in, you research it, and you find out that what you were hoping to find is actually not the case. And it kind of crushes you a little bit. But I used to have on my desk, but now is downstairs on my another one of my desks. I have this model of a ship. It's the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides. Now, I've always loved the ship and the stories that are told about her. And quite a number of years ago, I became fascinated because I heard a rumor that a Grand Master, to be specific, Brother Paul Revere here, had commissioned a lodge right there somewhere on the ship. So there I was thinking about some cool Masonic temple room on a boat, probably super small, just big enough to hold some short meetings. If you see this image on screen, this is a depiction of what the fictional the lodge over Simpkins store would look like, had that been a real lodge or anything. But I'm thinking very small, very concise. Just what you need, 3 guys. What are they doing in this small, teeny room on the boat? So I do the only thing I can do is I email Walter Hunt over at the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts to get any records I can. So after emailing them several times, I get some crushing news. The bad news is that according to them, there was not ever a lodge commissioned on board the USS Constitution by Paul Revere. But the good news is that there is indeed a lodge which is located on the ship. And here's the catch. It's a military lodge, a military Masonic lodge rather, and it meets only once a year on the deck of the ship. And it was actually commissioned in 1926, which was the 150th anniversary of the Siege of Boston, of the British evacuation of Boston. So the name of the lodge is the General Henry Knox Lodge. It's composed of active and veteran armed forces. And so although the lodge wasn't active in the days of the Revolution, the fact that the ship was in service and fought for our independence, and that a lodge was now meeting there on occasion, was more than a little cool. Now, this is usually where this presentation used to end when before I got these documents. So what I'm going to show you are a set of documents, and these hadn't been widely circulated. They have now. You may have already now. But I believe I was one of the first people to receive these, and I got to use them in a presentation that I gave to Ezekiel Bates Lodge with Masonicon a few years ago, which was even filmed by cable access, among other things. But these documents are pretty interesting. We hear all the time about people say, oh, Masons start revolutions. And we did all of these really amazing things. And we planned everything. And then we have Masonic historians who say, no, we didn't plan everything. And you can't say that we did this and you can't say we did that. And in many cases, that is correct. However, one day over lunch, actually it was dinner with a good friend of mine, he said, I have something for you. And I was like, oh, great. And he sent me an email. He said, open up your email. So we're eating dinner and I open up the email And here it is. And I said, oh, I already have this. He goes, not in this high resolution. So I said, okay, great. So I start looking at the image. Now, of course, this is the same thing that we had seen before, that Masonic parchment. Now, I'm not sure that in 1773 they were putting the G in the square and compasses, so I can't say whether that is added later or maybe it was being used then. I have not had an analysis done on this at all, but it's just my thought. But it was interesting, as if somebody was trying to say, yes, it is Masonic, but maybe it isn't. I don't know. The second image, as I went through this email, we got this, and it says, of the many underscored requests for information, copies, scans, etc., yours is the first I have responded to. Now, what this is it's saying, I'm asking, I have continually emailed the Grand Lodges for these minutes. I want the minutes of the night of the tea party, and I can never get them. Well, it says enclosed are 2 copies of the pages you requested. Please do not copy them, retain them, or give them to any other entity. Use them in your lecture and then destroy them. The lodge at St. Andrew was the only lodge that played a part in the tea party. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm starting to get goosebumps as I open these now. Now remember that these documents hadn't been seen by everybody at this point. And what we see here on the left, I'm going to make my screen a little bit bigger, is a few weeks before, 15 days before, 17 days, something like that. And really nothing that interesting, a regular lodge meeting, except at the bottom there, last 2 lines, consignment of tea, right? A few weeks before. And then the day of the Boston Tea Party, we have an adjournment due to lack of brothers present. So I think this is pretty interesting, Did they open and immediately close for plausible deniability? And certainly we had a hand in planning it. I don't think that is up for debate any longer. But there it is. I mean, we were talking about it a couple weeks beforehand. So let me move this here. So really, in conclusion, I just want to say that countless lodges from around the world continue to meet in this manner, and that is in these pubs, pub-style masonry, over drinks, meals. And many of the brothers who cannot meet this way will typically meet this way after a meeting for additional brotherhood and fellowship outside the lodge and in a tavern or a pub. Now, I'd like to remind everybody that though the buildings and the taverns that begat some amazing groups and that truly shaped this country, that were born in those institutions or those buildings or the establishments, they were upright citizens, and a good deal of them were Freemasons. And more than the often repeated facts that are thrown away regarding the signers of the Declaration of Independence or other documents, founding documents of the United States, I believe that some of these facts and stories that I've presented here this morning might tell a better story of the way that our fraternity has influenced our way of life and the formation of our great country. By exploring these groups, the men and the Freemasons, which set an example for a country that so many others tried to emulate and have emulated since, we see industry and fidelity and character that really make our country great. And oftentimes we ask ourselves, how could Masons have started a rebellion? We took an oath that includes allegiance to our country. Well, number one, I have to ask, when did we insert that into the ritual? But aside from that, that is true. We did take that oath, but we also took an oath to a more important duty, which is to be upright, courageous, and stand for what's right. And we took an oath to relieve the distressed. And at that point in our great nation's history, there's an awful lot of distress. Now, the taverns which held our and hosted our first lodges here in America, many of them are gone, but the spirit that's forged within is really ever present. This colonial spirit and fortitude lives on in the fraternity forever. And while tavern masonry may be a thing of the past, it's really far from dead. And there's something lastly that I want to say within this presentation that I hoped you picked up on. And this is the idea of freedom, liberty, and equality. This idea, equality, is this Masonic tenet of justice. It's not so much the idea of an eye for an eye. This is lifting somebody up to your level. We have the idea of condescension in Freemasonry, all of these things. It's lifting up to your level and ensuring this for all men, all women, all children. And it really is a Masonic idea. And that is the end of this presentation. I want to thank you guys very much. If you're at all interested, I wrote a business book with Brother John Ruark, and we'll be presenting for a lodge in New York, I think on the 18th of this month. If you're interested, let me know. You can find me at all these glorious interweb places. And notably, a really great project that I believe in wholeheartedly is something called the Masonic Legacy Society, which touches on the ideas of freedom and what we talked about in this presentation. And it's really an honor to be part of a group of guys who came up with this and put it together. Guys like Chuck Dunning and Akram Elias and Dago Rodriguez, these upstanding gents from around the country put this thing together. So if you're interested, check it out. And if you have any questions, please email me at wcypodcast@gmail.com. That includes if you're looking for any citations, a bibliography. My only request is that when I send those things to you, you also fill out a peer review to let me know how I did in this presentation. So with that, that's all.
Okay, well, thank you once again, Brother Johnson. We have some time for questions. This has been an excellent presentation, and I'm sure it's raised some eyebrows. And we've got amazing lecture, Right Worshipful Brother Johnson. Thank you very much. Also, remember that you can put questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom meeting. You can also put a comment in on the Facebook live stream, and if you have a question there, we'll ask it of Brother Johnson. Also, they're digging the beard, Brother Johnson. I'm assuming it's your beard, so.
Well, yours is quite much longer than mine. Mine never gets long. It just kind of gets like fluffy and does this thing. And then eventually I smile and I look like a dandelion. Just, that's pretty funny.
I've got a question here for you to get us started. I'm curious as to what was the biggest aha moment in your research? Was it the documents you showed at the end, or just the overall themes that you were picking up?
Yeah, I had really three of them. The first was I had done all this research about the formations of the U.S. Marine Corps that I was doing research for Iron Mike magazine. And we were putting together this issue for the anniversary, their birthday. And when I went back and I looked at the history, I started kind of cross-checking things, and I just went, oh my God, every place that we started, we took a movement toward independence. And maybe not independence, but like, I don't know, is self-adjudicating a word? I don't know. Anyway, but like anywhere we took a stance to say, hey, we can do a little something ourselves. There's like these Masonic institutions either in those same buildings. And I have to say, like, that was eye-opening. Of course, it was eye-opening when we found out about the General Henry Knox Lodge, which may have been common knowledge to our Massachusetts brothers, but not a lot of people know about this. So that was incredibly enlightening as well. And then, yeah, getting those scans of the minutes was an intense moment. And more intense than that actually was right before I went to present this, and I didn't know that, like, 1080p video for a cable access station in Massachusetts was going to be recording this. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm about to show these documents that there was all there was all these, warnings about. And I went to the grand historian at Mass, and I said, hey, are you okay with all this? I had him review it. And he said, yeah, I'm cool with it. And it was funny because Walter Hunt is the Masonic history guy. And so there I am giving this lecture, and maybe not an aha moment, but a sweat and bullets moment is when I'm giving this lecture and I'm looking in the back of the room over a couple hundred people, and Walter's standing in the doorway, and he's kind of got that thing where he's like leaning up against the door, like in the doorway, just waiting. And when it was all done, like he gave like this head nod, he like turned and he walked out and grabbed a cup of coffee. And I was like, whew, if Walter thought it was good, it must have been okay. So yeah, those were astounding documents. And while those documents have made circulation quite a bit, what they like, I don't talk them up too much, but what they do imply is something pretty incredible. If you were able to say that Freemasons decided to start talking about dumping tea a couple weeks before it happens, Merry Christmas, American continent. You're going to have independence soon. If you started talking about that in high school, in the history books that we're taught, like these little bits or whatever, what could happen? Would we be vilified? Or it is interesting to think about. But anyway,
okay. We have a question from Brother Ryan Flanagan. You mentioned these former meetings were over drinks and meals. Can we say for certain that the drinks and meals were consumed during the meeting, or was it similar to our meetings today, that they came before or after the meeting with a shorter travel time?
Yeah, great question, Ryan. It's probably a mix of both. However, I think there is probably the emphasis over drinks and meals, and I'll tell you why. Because if we trace ritual and what it looks like, Pennsylvania ritual is still done in a way, I have to mind myself because I know this is on Facebook, but is still done in a way that it looks like if you were going to take the ritual for a degree and say you have to do this at a table where people are sitting close, that's how it looks and how it operates. So based on that alone, I think it is sufficient enough in some respects to say that, yeah, a lot of this stuff happens around a table in a pub. Maybe it was in the back corner, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just loud and obnoxious. I mean, it certainly probably doesn't look like it does today with, due solemnity and everything, but maybe it was. I know we do have records. You can look in your Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite manual. It talks about, being in the storerooms in the basements, and we have tilers who are erasing the trestle boards that are drawn into the dirt floors. So there is likely some of that going on. But I mean, I think much of the time, lectures and talk about the degree themselves is probably done over the meals and drinks. I see Robert Davis is on the call today, and he is eminently qualified probably to answer that with his books, A Mason's Words. That is one of my favorite books.
Yes, Robert, and thank you so much for your presentation. That was just delightful. I thought originally we were going to have a gallop through the tavern tradition itself, and you actually brought out some very interesting features about specific taverns and specific people that were associated with our early colonial history. So thank you very much for that. I agree with you 100%. The taverns uh, were the pillars of social activity. They they were commercial centers for transportation and communication. They were the staging point for thousands of carriers who rode the kingdom, distributing commodities and weekly newspapers. They were uh, they were just simply the centers of economic communication. And the ale houses had their own clientele, very much like taverns would today. Um, uh, Various professions would tend to get together and at their favorite tavern, and that's where they would make their economic connections and things like that. And another thing I think that we need to envision about tavern life in the 18th century is we're not talking about just one big room with a bar and a number of tables. We're talking about multi-room establishments. Many of them were 2 or 3 stories. And so you may have as many as 20 rooms in one tavern. So you can see with that setting, any group of men could go into one of those rooms and they could have any kind of conversations that they wanted to have. But in the early period of which you primarily mentioned, the degrees weren't done in the setting that we think of today. You're right as you can be. They were literally done around the table, and because the degree ceremonies themselves were very little more than just the obligation and explanation of the old charges, and so men learned about Freemasonry around the table while they were feasting and eating. And as a matter of fact, it can be argued that the early catechisms came from that exact setting. So, and another distinction that I think might be important is that there was the tavern life, and there were also the alehouse guilds, and they were separate organizations. By the time of the 18th century, the guilds were pretty much falling apart. And so the alehouse guilds became places for the old guild craftsmen to get together to seek and find employment, to learn new skills. And so it was the alehouse guilds is actually where we could argue that we have our beginnings, more so than the English tavern. And I say that because the four alehouses that supposedly met together, to form the Grand Lodge of England, the Premier Grand Lodge, those were all occupied by the alehouse guild clientele, the craftsman clientele. And so I just think that's kind of another interesting aspect of this transition from the guild era to speculative masons. And we might also need to understand that this whole idea of tavern life and alehouse life pretty much ended at the end of the 18th century. And I think that's because it may have been because of the William Morgan affair, but certainly there was a time where all of the clergymen participated in the taverns and guilds, the social life, and all of a sudden they left the guilds, and we think perhaps it was as a result of the impact of the Morgan affair, and all of a sudden everybody's eyebrows, became raised about, these Freemasons, and when that happened, at the same time, Freemason halls sort of moved out of the tavern era and then started building their own buildings, which could be much more commodious. And as the ritual improvements became more and more known, then they obviously needed to have, lodge spaces large enough to actually perform rituals similar to what we do today. So that's kind of my comments, as an addendum to your talk. But I very much enjoyed your talk, and thank you so much for taking your time to giving us that information, Robert.
Oh, absolutely. Unquestionably a labor of love. And of course, your books also help in this research. So thank you, Most Worshipful.
Do we have any other questions for Brother Robert? We've had lots of good comments about the presentation, and I want to echo those, Brother Robert. This has been an excellent presentation. I have listened to this a couple years ago when you first gave it, and I've listened to it a few times since then, and I thought this is some information we have to get out there. This is some stuff that people think about, they talk about, and it's good for them to know the facts. If we don't have any other questions, I do.
Worshipful Master, I think you have a question from William Hare.
William Hare. Why don't you go ahead and read that for us, brother, because I can't find it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I more or less had a comment instead of a question. Many years ago, I heard a talk on origins of phrases, and the one that came to my mind about how it was tied into Masonic and the taverns was the phrase "mind your P's and Q's." And the fellow or brother who was given the talk said that it originated from "mind your pints and quarts," because they didn't want them to get too rowdy during the meetings, at the Masonic meetings being held in the taverns. So I thought that was pretty interesting how it ties into the lodges being started in the taverns.
Yeah, there's actually some really interesting history about that. It's mentioned in a book that I read about the advent of gin houses. Beer was done away with for a while, and gin houses started. But yeah, fascinating stuff.
Okay. I would like to share a few things that we're going to be coming up soon. Okay. And that would be a few of the resources that we have available from the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma. For those of you that haven't been to the website recently, there is it's gloklahoma.com. And if you go up to the top and click on Masonic Education, you'll find links to Speakers Bureau, archived Masonic presentations. There's tons of links to videos and audio talks, links to online Masonic education resources. There's lots of podcasts out there that are really good. We have a section on recommended reading and also some correspondence courses from the Grand Lodge. Also want to let you know about the Oklahoma Masonic Education Facebook group. That is a private group, but I recommend that you join if you have an interest in Masonic education and are an Oklahoma Mason. And then also want to make sure that you're aware of our next presentation, which will be with Brother Michael Paul from Louisiana. And he's going to be presenting on early Oklahoma and Louisiana Masonic Scottish Rite connections. And that will be Saturday, February 6th, not the 5th, but the 6th at 10 a.m. And the link is there at the bottom. Also, you can just watch the Oklahoma Lodge of Research Facebook page, and there'll be links to register there and to watch online live. So with that being said, I'll leave it to Most Worshipful Robert Davis as our Grand Master, if you'd like to share anything.
Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you for facilitating our own Oklahomans' awareness of the educational resources that are being made available by our Grand Lodge Education Committee through the website and the Facebook page. I would perhaps selfishly want to add to the upcoming events that you mentioned is that I'm having a Grand Masters web forum on the fourth Wednesday of every month. And the first one will be held this month. I think that's January the 27th. All of these will be held at 7 p.m. And I'm using that format because of our inability to have meaningful conversations in our lodges because of the restricted numbers that we're having to follow until this virus settles down. But we are going to be talking about the systemic and cultural or structural issues that have prevented our fraternity from having the ability to grow in the last 70 or 80 years. We're going to talk about the possibilities that exist today that can address all of those issues, can actually change the direction that Freemasonry can take in the future. But all of this stuff has to be based on an understanding that nothing changes unless we change the way we do things and the way we think about things and the way we respond to what our own future can look like. And so I think you're going to find that these Grand Master forums are going to be interesting. They're going to be enlightening. They should generate good discussions, and my hope is that over a period of a few months we can begin to develop kind of a collective consciousness that our future is totally up to today's Masons, and we have precious few years left to see this turnaround. And so we need to start thinking together, and I think the digital forum that we have is going to be an excellent means of communicating to a number of people at one time. So if you want to, January 27, join the Grand Masters forums. I'd be delighted to have you participate in those. And thank you again, Robert. Very much enjoyed it.
Okay, well, that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for attending. Thanks again, Brother Robert, for a fantastic presentation. And we'll see you all next month. Thank you.